Hey, Aaron Rabinowitz here for Red Giant. Even if you're strictly an After Effects user, sooner or later, you're going to be handed a 3D render to integrate into your motion graphics work. A 3D render is rarely complete on its own. Often it needs color correction, blurs, and motion graphics elements added into it. So in this episode of Red Giant TV, Harry Frank will walk you through the process of color correcting and enhancing a 3D render in After Effects. Take it away, Harry.
Hi folks, Harry Frank from Red Giant here. In this tutorial, we'll be taking a 3D render and doing some color correction and color grading on this. And we'll also do some compositing tricks. So rather than construct this animation, we're going to be working with final renders and tweaking a render that was handed off to us. Now, if you want to see the initial setup of this, you can go to sterneffects.com and check out Aaron Stern's tutorial on creating shield, background, and 3D type animation entirely in After Effects using Freeform Pro and Shapeshifter AE, both available from metal.com. So bouncing off of that, we're taking renders and we're fixing them up and getting them all ready for broadcast. So let's take a look at the source material that we got to work with. Let's create a comp here. This is Captain Numerica number 2. I've got RGBA renders of the background, the text, and the shield, and I also have depth passes. First, let's put together the 3 elements that we've got to work with for our logo. So we've got a background, shield, and text. I'm going to select these in the order top down that I like them. So I want the text first, the shield, and then the background. So text, shield, background, drop these into the composition, and we've got them in the right order top down. So the first thing I'm going to do is the color correction process. So I'll create an adjustment layer. This will be for Magic Bullet Colorista 2. Colorista 2 is a very powerful color correction and color grading plugin. Now I'm just going to be doing my color correction with Colorista 2, and I'll be doing my color grading, the sort of stylized color look of the animation in Magic Bullet Looks. Color correction is exactly what it sounds like. We are correcting colors that we think need a little bit of tweaking. I think the red is a little bit saturated. I think the blue and the reflection map of the text is also a little bit saturated, and I'd like to push the hue of this blue to match the color in the shield, which is a bit more of a cyan. This yellow highlight coming from a light off to the side, I think is more on the yellow-green side of things, and I'd like to bring it a little bit more into a warm yellow tone. We'll add a little bit of contrast and exposure to this just to brighten it up and give it a little punch. And then from there, we'll start to explore color looks like bleach bypass or black and white or sort of dreamy gold. So that color grading process is going to be completely different from fixing colors. So let's get to fixing the colors first. Colorista 2 is perfect for this. Now, if I close this up, you'll see we've got 3 different sections here. This master section is actually targeted at creating some sort of color look, but you really have to know what you're doing. There's nothing wrong with creating a look in Colorista. You just have to have a detailed idea what you're looking to do. So I can add some punch with some curves, maybe bring up the mid-tones a little bit here. Maybe in the blue curves, adjust the blue contrast so it cools off a little bit, and go into highlights and maybe add some warmth by pushing the highlights a little more orange, but the shadows maybe a blue leaning towards purple. So you really have to know what you're doing. There's no presets that we can browse or sort of ideas that we can get off of existing ideas and then tweak to taste. So let me hit reset on that, and we'll just use the primary color corrector here to get our colors tweaked and in line with what we'd like. So I mentioned the red is a little saturated, the blue is a little bit saturated, and the hue is a little bit off. So let's start correcting some of these things. So in the primary corrector here, we've got our shadows and midtones and the highlights. I won't be touching those too much. I'm going to jump down to the primary HSL wheels here. This changes hue and saturation, and this changes hue and lightness. So if I drag the hue one way or the other, we'll change the hue of the red. If I drag this lightness towards the center, it'll make that red darker or lighter if I bring it away. I can double click on it to reset it. So what I want to do is desaturate that red just a little bit. Now I can take this red here and drag it down to desaturate it But notice what I'm doing is, well, I'm using a stylus here, and as I drag it down, I'm actually changing the hue one way or the other. If I'd like a very detailed readout of what's going on with my color, I can click on this icon right here, and I can see that my red has been shifted almost 5%. We've desaturated at 66%, and my lightness is at 0. So I'll double click on that hue to reset it and bring this saturation back up to just around 30. Now, I can use my color wheel for that blue because I said I want to change the hue and change the saturation. So I'm going to take this blue and bring it towards the center and drag it towards the cyan a little bit to match these colors a little bit better. This little yellow highlight on the bottom of the shield, I'm going to take this yellow and push it more towards the orange just to warm it up a touch. Now, if we want some very, very detailed color correction, we can actually go into the secondary here. We don't need it, but I just want to make you aware of it. So in the secondary here, if I do something very dramatic, like change the hue of everything, it's going to affect everything in the image. But if I'd like to restrict this to a very specific area, well, I can use things like masks, which are one way to do it. But there's also a keyer here that if I hit edit, it's going to bring up a keying window, and I can actually use a keyer to isolate very, very specific colors. And this keyer is very powerful and allows you to get very detailed restriction to a color. So you have different ways to adjust the color visually. Now, in terms of this demonstration, I'm not going to be doing that. I just wanted to make you aware of it. I'm just going to click on bypass for that secondary and stick with our primary color correction. Now, before I get too far, I'm going to bring the exposure up just a touch. And the density, which is basically a contrast control, I'm going to bring that down just a little bit. This text, I think, is just a tad on the dark side. So now, there's nothing wrong with throwing a simple levels effect on here. Let's go to color correction levels, bring this gamma down a little bit to brighten it up, and bring the output black up as well so that the darkest areas don't drop below 20. Now, one thing I need to watch is this detail in the text right here. We have some lighter areas in the front area or front middle area of the text. And as I add more contrast and more effects, I don't want to lose that detail in there. And in fact, I should have a way to easily reference the original here before I get too far. So I'm going to turn off all of my effects. And right at 5 seconds, which is a good reference time, I'm going to hit Shift F5. And let's turn my effects back on. So as I'm going along, if I go back to that 5-second mark, I can simply hit F5 to reference the original, or AB as we say it. A is the original and V is the new one. I can go back and forth and make sure that the detail is still there and that I'm doing something good to the colors. Now, before I get into adding a color look to this, or stylizing the color, that contrast that I would add in the look, I think, is going to be exaggerated by other things that I'm going to do in compositing. So I'm going to do some of those things first, like the shadows on the text. In fact, I'll add shadows on the text and the shield. So to do this, I'm going to duplicate this layer, this text. So I've got 2 different layers. And on one of these layers, in fact, I don't need this levels here. Just get rid of that because that's going to be some unnecessary processing. In perspective, I'm not going to use drop shadow, but I'm going to use radial shadow. And what this does is projects a shadow based on the alpha channel of the image, which is exactly what we want. But what we don't want is for the shadow to fall where the shield isn't. So we want the shadow just to hit the shield. So to do that, I'll use channel, set matte, and use the alpha channel of the shield render. So now I'll just restrict that shadow to the shield, turn up the softness a little bit, maybe push the projection distance out just a touch. Oh, and I want to make sure to click on shadow only so that it's just rendering the shadow, and then now this one has the full text. Let's copy and paste that to the shield, uncheck shadow only, and lower the projection distance and turn up the softness. I should probably label this layer shadow to shield. And then if I want to make one to the wall, I could just duplicate that. I'll rename this shadow to wall. And all I need to do is go into my set matte, click on invert so that it inverts it, and probably give a little bit more projection distance, a little bit more softness, and turn down the opacity. All right, now we're in a good spot to start doing some color look manipulation to this. And we'll do that in Magic Bullet Looks. So let's create another adjustment layer. I'm going to rename this Magic Bullet Looks. And apply Magic Bullet Looks. Now I'll click on Edit to go into the Looks interface. On the left, you'll find all of the Looks presets. And over on the right, you'll find all the tools that are used to make those presets. Tools are divided into 5 sections: subject, matte box, lens, camera. So all of the tools that you'll find available in the tools section all relate to one or more of these sections. So all of these presets are simply chains of tools that you put together to create a look. So I'm going to start with this blockbuster look right here in the popular film section. Now it's a pretty extreme effect, but we can tone it down a bit. The first thing I usually do if I'd like to tweak an effect is just start turning on and off the different tools to see what kind of effect that they have. And you'll find that majority of what we're seeing is handled in this lift gamma gain effect in the post process. So we're pushing different parts of the image into different colors, and we're basically getting this sort of dark shadow, kind of warm highlight type of feel. We also have a little bit of a cooling in the midtones. It does feel a little bit dark, so I'm going to take the lift and push that up. And I'm going to bring the gain up just a little bit as well. So that's one look that we can do. I can save this. Let's call this CN01. Let's try something else a little bit more contrasty and more of a film emulation look. So I'm going to emulate a bleach bypass effect. So we can go into stock emulation and select bleach bypass, or perhaps bleach bypass light. Negative bleach bypass is one of the tools that we have available to apply to the camera, and we can adjust parameters like silver retention and exposure compensation. It does mute it just a little bit, so I'm going to go into the saturation and push the saturation up just a bit. Now, it's a pretty straight effect. In other words, we basically have made it very contrasty and kind of muted. I like the mood of this, but I would like to push it a little bit more towards a cool kind of effect. So I'm going to go into the curves, go under blue in the contrast, and push the contrast up just a little bit, just to cool it off. Let's call this CN2. Let's go into the cinematic section and select Ultimatum. This uses a tool called Shutter Streak, which is only available to the camera body itself. And we can sort of boost that out and get kind of an interesting effect here. It does look a little bit dark, and I think that's coming from the contrast effect here. I might go into the tools here under Post Process, select the Colorista 3-way color corrector, and I'll tone down the shutter streak a little bit. Save that. There, so I've got 3 different looks that I've saved. I can bounce back and forth between all of these that I've saved, 1, 2, and 3 up here, just to see which one I like. And I think I'll stick with this blockbustery kind of feel. So once I decide that I like that, I can hit finish, and this will take me back to the After Effects interface. Now in After Effects, even if you find it still a little bit too heavy of an effect, we can go into the adjustment layer, view the opacity, and turn down the opacity and mix that effect back in with the rest of the image. Same goes for the color correction that we did with Colorista. Now let's hit F5 to see where our color correction has taken us. Okay, now let's add a little bit of particle dust and a lens flare effect to sort of wrap things up here. Now to get this, I need to get my camera move. So I'm going to go to my finished version of this and copy my null object and camera from the original. This is going to be pretty vital in getting particle motion to match up with your camera. Now that I've got my camera in there, I'll go to New Solid and create a layer for my particular dust. Let's go to Trap Code Particular. And we'll see that this is reacting to the camera movement. It matches up quite nicely. What I want to do is create sort of an ambient dust in here. So rather than having a point of particles that start at a single point and emit outward, I'm going to set this to box, and I'll set my velocity to 0 just for the time being. So what we can see is the box area in which the particles are being born, which is a 50 by 50 by 50 pixel area right here. So this gives me a pretty good indicator of the size of the box that we're working with. So let me go to X, stretch that way out. Let's go to Y, stretch that out. And in Z, let's give it a certain amount of depth for these particles. Also, let's go to the camera, make sure our depth of field is on. And the aperture, if you want sort of a very heavy out of focus kind of look where particles close to the camera are getting very out of focus, you can really crank up this aperture to kind of an unrealistic amount. But basically the only thing we're affecting is the particles in here. So don't be shy to crank up that aperture very high. Now in the particle dust, I'll go to the particle section. I'm going to turn down the size to, let's say, 0.5 or 0.6 maybe. We want just a very subtle particle effect. Let's go into the particles per second and crank this up so we've got quite a bit more in here. So now you can see the little specks of dust floating around in here. And as I turn this aperture up and down, as it gets closer to 0, they're basically all solid little white points. If I turn this up, start to see very sort of fine out of focus areas that as they get closer to the camera get more and more out of focus. Now speaking of focus and depth of field, I mentioned we had those depth passes from our renders. So let's go to our project here and go to the depth section. I have a background depth pass, the shield depth pass, and the text itself. So I'm going to drop these in, and I'll make these shy because we don't need to see them, we just need them to be there. So let's turn on the shy switch for the comp and turn on the shy switch for the layers. Now for each of these layers, I'll apply the lens blur effect. And we have to apply it individually to each layer because each layer needs a different map to apply to it. Otherwise, I just use an adjustment layer, but we can't do that. So in CS 5.5 or higher, you've got camera lens blur. If you have CS 5, you have something just called lens blur. They pretty much act the same way. Lens blur just renders a lot faster and has a lot more control in here. But basically, you're going to do the same thing in each, which is apply a blur map. So for this text, I'm going to go to the Cap Numerica depth only. So what you'll see is that areas more distant to the camera are out of focus and areas closer to the camera are a little bit more in focus because of the depth pass that we've got. So darker areas back here and lighter areas towards the camera. If you'd like a little bit less of that blur, you can just dial down the blur radius. So let's just copy and paste this. I'll go to the shield layer and change the source map, the shield depth, and then the same thing on the background. Changing the blur map to the background depth. Maybe I'll turn that background blur up a little bit more. Blurring that background gives it a lot more shallow of a feel, where the objects in the foreground are a lot more in focus. Now, that's a bit extreme. Let's dial this back down. Maybe to 6 or so. Now next I'm just going to add some lighting and effects. I'm going to add 2 different things here. I'm going to use Trapcode Shine to add a little bit of volumetric light, and then I'm going to add a simple lens flare over to the side. So let's add the shine first. So this is Trapcode Shine. Apply this to an adjustment layer. Now I'm going to push this source point kind of back here. We'll modify that layer, but I just want to get the look started here. So I'll set the blending mode or transfer mode to add. Go into colorize and set this to 1 color and set this to a white kind of color. And I'll turn the shine opacity down quite a bit, maybe 50% or even lower than that. But I will go into shimmer and push this up quite a bit just so that we can see some of those light rays kind of popping off of the alpha channel. What I'm trying to simulate here is not just throwing shine on here, but a little bit of a volumetric light effect. So if this was kind of shiny and we had a bright light source hit it and we had some sort of maybe fog or something like that to give a bit more volume feeling to the atmosphere, we might see a little bit of a volumetric light effect coming from the shield. But things are moving in 3 dimensions in this animation, and Shine is a 2-dimensional plugin. But there's a very commonly used expression to convert this 2-dimensional point and map it to the 3D space of the scene. So I'll show you how to do that. Let's just create a null, make that 3D. I'll rename this the Shine null. And in Shine, I'm going to create an expression, just Option or Alt click on the source point, grab this thing here called the pick whip, and target that null layer. And then without doing anything else, just type period, lowercase 2, capital C-O-M, oops, autosave got me in there, C-O-M-P, start parentheses, and then brackets, 0, 0, 0, and then end our parentheses. So don't forget both the parentheses and the brackets. Parentheses, brackets, 0, 0, 0, end brackets, and parentheses. Basically, this is going to convert that space of the 3D null and calculate the relative 2D point. So I'm going to push this way back here. So now as my camera moves around, you can see that we have the light rays sort of shooting off that way, and then as the camera swoops around, we still have the light rays sort of shooting in the correct direction over here. It's a very useful technique. Now I'm going to add just a little bit of a lens flare over on the side. In fact, I'm going to keep this very simple. I'm just going to use Null Light Factory Easy and pick PV1. Click on Use Unmult, move this over to the side, hit F4 and set my blending mode to screen. See how I'm starting to lose a little bit of that detail in that text. And I think this is largely happening from the shine, so I'm going to dial that down even more and maybe dial down the look. There we go. So now that I've added all these additional elements after my color correction, watch the big change as I move my look and my color correction above these elements. Quite a big change. So the shine and the lens flare all conform to the look and color correction that we've added. So it looks like to me that we need to tone things down a little bit more. So I'm going to tone down that shine even more, maybe down to 25%, just bring it down a touch. And that Null Light Factory plugin that we added, I'm going to bring the brightness of the flare down maybe to 80 or 85%. I think the particular dust is just a bit much at this point, so let's go to the opacity, maybe set that to 50%. Another thing I never did is change the size overlay or perhaps opacity overlay. So as these particles are created, they don't just pop in and out. I need to have them sort of fade up and then fade down. Now, one last thing I'm going to do just to add a touch of warmth is add some Trapcode Star Glow. So let's create another layer, make that an adjustment layer, and go to Trapcode Star Glow. I'm going to add the preset Warm Heaven here and go to my color map. So color map A and B are driving the colors here. As you can see, individual colors using color map A and color map B. Color map A is a little bit pink. I'm going to move that color down here to a much warmer color. Starting to warm things up a little bit. It's way too much, and we're definitely going to start blowing out those highlights when the camera passes straight on and that reflection map hits the center of our text right here. So I'm going to go to the pre-process and raise that threshold quite a bit, and then also go into the Star Glow opacity down here. Turn that down. I just want a subtle sort of warming kind of filter on it. Now, overall, if you'd like to warm this up without kind of jumping back into that looks interface, we can definitely do that in Colorista here and just jump into the primary shadow, midtone, and highlight section and maybe warm up the midtones just a touch. Or perhaps those highlights we can warm up too. I'm just going to do the midtones just a smidge. Let's move these. Just a very subtle orange. So if I double click that to reset it, that's where it is, and then I'll undo to get that back. So I hope this tutorial has shown you the power of color correction and color grading, even in motion graphics. It's quite a vital step in making your renders feel very finished and polished. Hope you learned something. My name's Harry Frank. Thanks for watching.
Thanks, Harry. Or should I say, Harry Frank, the first motion graphics Avenger. Okay, maybe not the first, but certainly one of the best. If you enjoyed this tutorial, check out Harry's site at graymachine.com, where you can find a whole bunch of awesome goodies, including free presets, tutorials, and a link to Harry's fantastic training DVDs, like Complete Training for Trapcode Particular or Trapcode Form Training. Also, don't forget to check out Harry's killer Red Giant Guru preset packs, looping backgrounds for Trapcode Suite, cinematic flares for No Light Factory, video rock for Particular, weddings for Trapcode Suite, and holidays for Particular. Because hey, it's always that most wonderful time of the year. And by the way, you can get all of those and much more as a part of the Red Giant Guru Suite. Don't forget, you can download a free trial version of the software that Harry used in this tutorial at redgiantsoftware.com, and you can get free presets for Red Giant plugins on redgiantpeople.com. And to keep up with the latest news about new products, tutorials, tips, and deals, don't forget to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or on our blog. Once again, I'm Aaron Rabinowitz for RedGiantTV.com. I'll see you next time.